Stuart here. Today, software estimation. So an estimation is very easy. How long will something take and what will it cost? So we have to define our goals in terms of value. So value's got a bunch of fancy measurements. If you're in finance, you may have a riff on this with a lot more factors. But in general, for engineers, we just need to think about value in terms of what is the business gain from a particular unit of spend, or what does it prevent from being lost? What is the true cost, and is there a risk premium that detracts from the value? So, as I've said many times in this channel, success is a predictable tempo, which is the delivery of software at a consistent pace at the required quality, with risk that is managed and value that is realized. You can have the best piece of software your team's ever coded, but if it doesn't deliver business value, you miss the mark. Estimation is hard because there's a lot of things that can perturb our estimation. So have we done something like it before? Are we using tools we're familiar with? Are we introducing new things? What's the experience level of the people doing it? Are we assigning a task to someone who hasn't necessarily done that thing in that area of expertise, or with a tool chain that they're unfamiliar with, and poor assumptions about the alignment of roles to tasks? My favorite recently was someone who said, well, let's take Sandy because she's a SQL developer, and let's let her do a NoSQL database because they're all databases. It won't be difficult for her to figure this out. These are all things that have to be questioned during the estimation process. And I wanted to show why toolchain familiarity is important. I went looking for some stats on this. I saw a whole bunch of different data from different time periods. It doesn't seem to change much. Fundamentally, all of the curves render a sinusoidal sort of pattern, as you see here. There is that sharp upturn, and somewhere along that line, that's where productivity becomes predictable because the person using the tool chain knows enough to be useful. And at some point, time invested in the tool chain preemptively renders diminishing returns. It's one thing if you're tooling along using the tool chain and you go, wow, I have this kind of new use case. How does this tool chain handle it? And you do the research. That's useful. Trying to learn everything there is to know about the tool chain in advance of ever using it is not. You need to read up enough on the tool chain and do the exercises and the tutorials to the point at which you know what questions to ask and where to look. And then a good journey programmer will sort of peak out at not knowing everything, but knowing more than the average. And again, it's well above the predictable productivity point in the curve. So here's another thing nobody ever really considers. And that is, here are 5 typical roles on projects. And what I did was, I went and looked at a whole bunch of projects, including some of my open source ones and some of the ones I do for commercial customers. And I sort of picked out what people's days are like based on their role. Here are 5 people in 5 roles with completely randomly generated names. You know, I said I wanted all the names to end with a vowel and start with a consonant. And so I just random generated some names. And you can see it's color coded pretty simply. You can see the impact of, in the aggregate across all these people, about interruptions of any kind. Some roles have the luxury of taking, a longer lunch, or maybe they have to go and pick up their kids or whatever, right? So there's these scheduled breaks in their day. Other people completely live in, service interruptus. Prinu at the bottom there is a great example of that. That team member is a DevOps team member who's also doing a lot of support, and so they get interrupted constantly. Also, the impact that meetings have, and there's that nice little table, right? And so the rubric in most software engineering textbooks in the introduction for the economics of software is that a standard developer, someone who's not a supervisor, who's a team member, they could be expert or not, I call out Frey versus Billa. They're both developers of one kind or another. Billa is kind of the, developer, and Frey is maybe a specialist. So maybe they're a SQL Server person or a, infrastructure person or whatever. Doesn't really matter. The numbers sort of grind out to be the same. You can see the extended days. It's not uncommon for DevOps folks to have much longer days, and for people in the leadership cadre to have much longer days. Sometimes that's a function of time zones, but a lot of times it's a function of just the massive amount of work and the number of things they have to keep up on. And you can see that the basic rubric of 6.5 hours out of every 8 applies to Billa pretty well, but it doesn't apply to Frey pretty well at all. And the other roles it's completely off on. So if you start from this place that says, well, everybody, we're going to assume an 8-hour day, and we're just going to assume 6.5 hours of productivity because that's what the article said on the interweb, you're going to find yourself hideously overestimating your capacity and chronically under-delivering. Keep that in mind, right? You have to really think about, the role and how much heads down time they're going to get. Billa is the only one on the team that seems to get decent intervals of heads down time, and even they have some interruptions. You should also think about this, which is that a lead or a DevOps is essentially there to serve other people on the team in different ways. Leads give direction. They help get problems solved, right? They may not know the answer to everything, but their job is to unblock their development. And DevOps people are like, oh, this stopped working, help, And so the number of interruptions that we have in that chart is representative of a mature organization where the team has been on it for a while and there are standard operating procedures that are documented. There's an investment in self-service for log-breaking problems. There's educational materials, and the people on the project are comfortable and productive. Now, this only works if the churn on your project is manageable. If you have a 100-person team with a 5% churn or less, you can get to this place, this sustained engineering place. But if your churn is much more above that, the knock-on effect on the organization becomes worse and worse and worse. You can presume a percentage workday as a place to start, but you gotta correct. And the scrum leaders on your project, or whatever you want to call them, right? Project managers, whatever. Right? Doesn't matter what the title is. Their job is status and are we on track? They act to help coordinate between teams, for example, if there are dependencies and things like that. An experienced person in that role will understand that the activities at the start and the end of the project are different, and that once that first release goes, and then you're in this sustained enhancement and then finally sustained maintenance, that these are going to change as well. And then the other thing they get is that meetings are probably one of the most potentially, notice the word potentially in that sentence, destructive impacts on the capacity of a team. Now, there are people who will code during a meeting or debug during a meeting, but then they're not really paying attention to the meeting. If they're in the meeting and they don't really need to pay attention to the meeting, why are they in the meeting? If they're in the meeting and they need to pay attention in the meeting, then they shouldn't have cycles to do something else. And so it's very important that if you're going to do meetings, that you're just super strict about formalizing meeting structure. They need to start on time. They need to, wind down before the end of the meeting period so that follow-up items and assignments can be done. There needs to be meeting notes generated after the meeting. And you need to say the word parking lot if you need to park something, and then you come back to the parking lot items at the end and you say, okay, we'll spin up a separate, smaller meeting for this or whatever. Meetings are good and useful and sometimes required, but you better be able to articulate the purpose and desired outcome of the meeting in 2 sentences. the purpose of the meeting is X. The outcome that we expect is Y. Generally, the purpose of the meeting is to communicate status or problems, and the outcome of the meeting is that deviations from status and problems are identified and assigned to someone to help fix them. Ad hoc communication, which when I first started as a developer was only possible if you were where they were, has gotten much better. We now have tools like Teams. We've had email for a long time. If it's something that you need to memorialize the decision, an email is the thing to do. And then your Scrum Master, who should be, or Scrum Leader, pardon me, should take that email chain that ultimately has the decision in it and memorialize that by saving it into the feature or the user story or whatever. And ad hoc things tend to be a lot less disruptive. And an email is far less disruptive than a DM is. And a DM is the ultimate in disruption. But if you do a post and you at someone, they may not necessarily need to react right away. Again, if you need to memorialize it, then probably an email is the thing to do. If you just want to discuss something in sort of a threaded way, particularly if you have team members sort of scattered over time zones, and you're trying to get, what do you think the best practice is for this? Or, there's a couple of ways we could go about solving this problem. What's worked for you? What do you suggest? What would be a bad thing? And then stuff like, I'm so stuck. Can you just look over my shoulder and, do a screen share and let's figure this out? Or gears have completely stopped turning. My productivity has gone to zero. Please help me. And again, the leads and the DevOps tend to get that last DM style of communication where you're demanding instant attention. But understand that an interruption is an interruption. And context switching of the humans that were thinking about X and now have to think about Y is a real deal. And some people, through training and experience, can get really good at it. Really good DevOps, senior developer leads with fantastic memories are less disrupted, but they're still disrupted. So, it's important to think about that. One of the first questions I ask people, particularly dev leads who are kind of under-delivering, their team is kind of so-so, but they themselves are under-delivering, is, did we underestimate the amount of team and project support you are going to have to give during your day? And when they say, I don't know, I said, okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to have Post-it note or a piece of paper or a chalkboard, whatever you want, marker board, and every time you're interrupted by a DM where someone is demanding attention now, I want you to make a mark on the board. And we'll just assume they're an eighth of an hour apiece in terms of impact. And then I want you to do that for a week, and then I want you to come back to me and we'll talk about it. And if that's the case, then we need to find out if there is a training opportunity there, if we have a documentation opportunity, an opportunity to make a standard operating procedure or automate something, or perhaps guide people to a more asynchronous method of problem solving. And if we need to then adjust the expectation of the delivery of value for that human being from being a direct delivery of value to being an indirect delivery of value. Helping your team is an indirect delivery of value because you're accelerating them. Doesn't mean that what you're doing isn't valuable. It just means you're not directly contributing to the project deliverable. There should be some norms on your project, right? If you get invited to a meeting and 5 minutes into the meeting you go, this should have been an email, you should raise your hand and say so. And then whoever's moderating the meeting hopefully will come to that conclusion as well. Shoot the meeting in the head and say, we're going to continue this as an email. Joe, I want you to write an email to the people you invited on this list. These people go on the 2, these go on the CC, and start this as an email thread and flag it so that you need an answer by next Friday. Close the business. Increasingly, DM systems like Microsoft Teams respect do not disturb. You literally don't get notifications while you're trying to work. But if you're do not disturb all the time, you hugely diminish your availability to help others. So there's a balance to be had there. Other things that affect capacity. Unplanned work, including spontaneous meetings. I kid you not. On my current project, I think people have meetings because they're lonely or bored or they want to pick a fight or whatever, but it could have been an email. Blockers, right? Any kind of blocker, right? You lost your account access. Server that you depend on has stopped working or whatever. Your laptop is crushed. Poor estimations or uneven estimations across work. We're going to come back to that one. Unexpected problems. So, you sort of plan that you do A, B, C, D, E, F in the user story, and you get through about D and you go, oh no, there's insert magic here. Or that doesn't work the way we thought it would. Oh no. Requirements changes mid-development are absolutely ghastly. To be clear, the business has every right to adjust the requirements. They absolutely do. Business changes, situations change, priorities changes, funding changes. They absolutely are entitled to change the direction of a project. But if they do it in the middle of the execution, like mid-sprint, then we have created an enormous disruption where we have to stop what we're doing, make a new plan, get everybody to understand the execution of the new plan, and then execute the new plan, throwing out our commits for whatever planning period we're in. So, the business needs to take a certain amount of accountability for thinking far enough ahead that at least they won't interrupt the current planning interval, whatever it is. Sometimes it's as granular as a sprint, which is almost too granular, and sometimes it's the grand 5-year plan, and that's way too coarse. So somewhere in the middle, or to the left of the middle, is probably the happy place. 2 months, 3 months. But just understand that planning is an interruption that, while necessity, reduces capacity. The more time you spend planning things, maybe that investment pays for itself because you have a better definition of what you're delivering. And maybe that is an empty exercise or nearly empty exercise that could have just been user stories. Production and customer support interruptions, those are really important. You have to stop doing what you're doing to do them. And exceptional levels of defects, especially defects with very high severity. If you have a Sev 1, it means the entire platform is down. Sev 2 means a significant unit of functionality doesn't work. A Sev 3 is there's certain use cases that don't work like they should. And a Sev 4 is, wow, that's annoying, but the users can have a workaround. Understand that Sev 1s, bring a lot of the gears to a halt. Hopefully it doesn't impact the entire project team, but it's going to affect at least some of the team. False reporting of actual effort. And never attribute to malice what is explained by laziness or stupidity. Halon's razor. Unrecorded overtime and unrecorded lost time is a bad thing, right? Because people went into the planning interval, the sprint, whatever, with a certain expectation of team capacity. If you increase that capacity invisibly by working unreported overtime, then you got more done in less capacity, and so you have over-delivered. And not only is that bad because you set an expectation that you can do something complicated in fewer story points, but you're gonna run the people doing it crispy. And that's no good. The hero complex is just a terrible, terrible anti-pattern. And if you have humans that routinely do it, you either need to look at what will it take to split their job or help them prioritize better. One of the worst meetings I've been in the last 2 weeks is I asked somebody high up in leadership, we only have this much capacity. We have 2 things that have been identified as must do. Which of these things has priority? And the answer was both. And that's trying to get 5 pounds of flour into a 1 pound sack. No worky, right? You literally force people to become heroes and burn out, or you disillusion the people working for you and you smart size your organization, which is code for all the smart people leave. disruptors. What are things that keep us from delivering? And what does this have to do with estimation? Well, we estimated in the delivery of the estimation, we set a set of deliverables, right? And we said we're going to, on this day, those things are going to be available for testing and then for UAT and then release candidates. So if any of these four things are at work, your ability to hit that commit on that date, which is an important part of sustained engineering, which is my theme throughout all these YouTubes. And these disruptors break your ability to do that. Best of breed disease, introducing a new technology just because it's cool, when you already have a perfectly serviceable one. The one that comes to mind was, I'm on a project that uses a lot of Microsoft SQL Server. Is it the greatest database on planet Earth? That's a matter of opinion. Is it good enough for most business scenarios? You bet it is. And then someone comes along and says, I want to use the PDQ database. And we go, why? And they say, well, it's got some of these cool features and it's really interesting and I think we should give it a try. And your answer should be no. We're not here to put candy on your resume. If we get to a place where technically we cannot achieve our functional and non-functional values on our existing database, then we can have a conversation. But if you can hit 80% of what you need to do using the tools we have that are supported by the team that many people know, use that. And the corollary to that is that's really only going to get widely disseminated if you have best practices and you build a community of practice around the technology. So all the major technologies, and really if you think about the pillars video on YouTube that I did, there are only 5. If you pick, a technology for each one of those and stick with it and try to maximize it and get the most value out of it, you're going to have a much easier time. Teams that announce that they're somehow special and don't have to follow the shop standards, or they get to use their own choice of tools because, are going to be disruptors. At some point, their non-standardness is going to impact the delivery capacity of other teams. Sudden changes in business goals are bad. They happen. I mean, I'm in the middle of a project and they come to us all and they go, well, we thought we had to deliver this, but we've just been acquired by blah people and they have one of these. So now we need you to do systems integration. Fads, the root of all evil is CIO magazine, in my opinion, but fads occur in technical journals too. And people say, well, we should start doing this thing. And I go, okay, what are the features and benefits and how long is the training and what is the capacity impact? And, if they can't answer those questions, then the answer should be no. Security flaws? I hate to say it, but these can be major disruptors. And if the security flaw is discovered early, and as far as you can tell, it hasn't actually been exploited yet, and you can get out ahead of it, that's great. But understand that you just ate up a bunch of capacity that you had reserved for story points that you'd committed to. So you should have some sort of change request system, right? That says, hey, powers that be, you're not getting these things because there's this security flaw or there's this Sev1 production problem or whatever. Just so you know, we promised, but at the time we promised, we didn't know about this thing, and we've got to fix this thing. And because you told us, you agreed with us when we said we have to fix this thing, you went, oh, yes, you must. You must fix that thing. What you don't want to have happen is this. This is where your career dies. On the front page, above the fold of the San Jose Mercury News with a subheadline of bad things happened at PDQ Corp on Stuart Williams's project, followed by a half-page article with an extension onto page 11 detailing just how bad the mess-up was and the impact to the customers and the precipitous loss of trust through not only your own organization but all of your customers that follows will be incredibly depressing. What's required to do an estimation? Well, you need to have a pretty clear explanation in the story or whatever of what it is you're meant to do. You need to have acceptance criteria. And the test team has to go, okay, well, given what's in the user story and the technologies you're going to deliver it with, we can test it or we can't test it. If they say we can't test it, you got to go back and figure it out. Is it smart? I've seen requirements that say, like, make it like better, dude. Like, okay, like awesomely rocking. That is not a reasonable user story. And there are other videos on how to make good user stories and do product management and stuff like that. I just want to point out that you cannot estimate what you don't understand. And then if you have a story that has multiple roles across one story, split the story by role. And if you need to set predecessors and successors, by all means do that. And then you've got to do a shortest path analysis and decide whether or not you're going to have some of the work have to spill over into the next interval, whatever it may be. And then, is the story too big? Is the story too small? If the story is too big, you got to split it. If the story is too small, it needs to be aggregated. It needs to be related to the overall value of the delivery. So every user story, you should be able to, in a single sentence, say why that contributes to the business's goal. The business wants a system that allows customers to order widgets off the internet. What's their goal? They want to sell widgets, right? Your user story should have a linear connection to that. And user stories, therefore, are features, enablers, investments, preventers, things that prevent bad things from happening, like enhanced security and things like that. They are variations. A variation is giving different user communities, different experiences that are tailored to them. And of course, we always have to think about risk. The question is the user story overall smart? Is a pretty good litmus test for whether you can estimate it. If the answer to that question is no, then it can't be estimated. You got to go back and then if they refuse to improve on that, then you have to lay out all of your assumptions upon which your estimate is going to be based. Otherwise, when inevitably you don't deliver what they wanted, you can say, well, since you didn't give me the things I needed specifically, I wrote down as best I could what I thought they were, and that's what I delivered. And they say, well, you didn't deliver what we were dreaming about. And we go, well, you have to write things down for me to be able to do them. Had that conversation a lot in the last 40 years. Every task type and role has different things that are assumed to be in or out of the estimate. If you say something is 5 story points and you're a developer, what activities are you promising in that estimate? So typically not architecture, maybe not even design. Coding, documentation, testing, sure. Coordination, maybe. Validation and verification, probably not. Refactoring, maybe, if in order to implement your feature in an existing block of code, you have to play musical blocks on the code. Provisioning, typically not your problem. Neither is deployment, but you may, in order to succeed in your task for your role, you may need to have predecessors and successor. Like you've got this lovely piece of code and it's documented and it has tests and it's checked into source control and it's waiting. What's it waiting for? It's waiting for infrastructure to be provisioned and things to be deployed. So when you're done, it's not done, right? There are other people's stories, OPS, that need to be done. Consistency is predictability. And famously, Deming's observation is square on. One of the things that I see go wrong at the beginning of projects is this assumption that you can measure instantly. It takes time to make good prediction. And that's represented in the lower right-hand diagram of what's called the cone of uncertainty, which basically means the longer in time you go along, the better and better you get at figuring out how long something will take. And once you get into the magic place called the bounding box, where all of your estimates in the aggregate, right, not individual estimates, those are never ever going to be spot on except by accident. But if you were to say, okay, well, we have a 20-person team and each team can do, 2 stories per interval. And so we're going to have a data set of 40 things. If we were to come to the end of that interval and add up all the under and overs, what we hope is that they will be zero, right? The deviations will be zero. And if you've done stats, you talk about, well, you're pretty much on target with something that has kind of a linear progression. If you have identified sort of the average and the standard deviation, and the bounding box is defined by the average plus and minus 2 standard deviations, and that you should see a tendency, not in individual stories necessarily, but in the aggregate for those things to go to the average. And ideally, really, the average variance between what you estimated and what it actually took to deliver should go to zero eventually, plus and minus. And again, some tasks will be easier than we thought, some will be harder. But the idea is, in the aggregate, right, we're going to get to a place where we can make a commit of X number of story points and say, this is what fits in X number of story points, like Tetris blocks. We have people capable of exercising all the things. They're role appropriate. We've broken the stories up appropriate in predecessors and successors. And some of the stuff's going to be pushed in the next interval. And so we're going to pull some things into this interval to fill out our capacity. And we're going to reserve part of our capacity for technical debt and part of our capacity for stuff happens. Typically, you want to go about 10% for or more. The more mature your project is, the smaller that percentage can be. The less mature or newer your project is, the bigger that should be. At the start of a project, 25% is not off the hook crazy. And if you have stories for roles that are constantly being interrupted, like DevOps and leads, at the beginning of a story, their capacity to deliver deliverable work is probably going to be closer to 10% than it is to 50. Understand that if you perturb the things that went into the estimate by invalidating them so they're no longer true, a bunch of people changes, a bunch of project parameters, a bunch of circumstantial change. One of the things that recently has been reported on is the return to work thing has been hugely disruptive. In some rare cases for the better, and in a lot of cases not so much. But your mileage will vary. The point is, if there are events that disrupt your consistency, then you are going to have to some extent, back up your model and refigure it out. And your aggregate estimations will drift away from being centerline over and under zero, plus and minus a skosh. The eternal argument of hours versus, I will give you my personal opinion. Humans are bad at estimating actual duration. Here's a test you can do. Just gather your friends together and say, I'm going to look at my watch. Nobody else looks at anything that's keeping time. And I want you guys to raise your hand when 2 minutes happens. Exactly. I think you'll be entertained by the results. So the advantage to story points, especially using the planning poker methodology where the things are a Fibonacci sequence, is that humans are much better at thinking about relative levels of effort. And the Fibonacci sequence forces us to go and make over and unders that are consistently have the same spread of over under, even as the size increases. General rule of thumb is don't allow things to be estimated that are too big. And the other planning poker rules and about how to do it properly are located elsewhere on the interweb, and there are really great videos and even tools for that. You can do planning poker in ADO. You can do planning poker on free sites on the net. But consistency is the key. And again, you need to consider who and when as you think about that. Or you need to think about what are going to be forces that perturb the estimate. My personal thing is use story points, and then based on the time-sheeted hours quietly on the DL, people can look at delivered business value, in finance or product management, people who know how to do that kind of math, And they can draw a line between that and decide, in actual dollars, whether or not they're getting value out. So none of this work unless it's a dynamic. When you finish something and and it's yours, and you have to adjust your the thing that started as an estimate to be the actual, because that's what we're going to delta off of, right? That's what we're going to record and compute and roll up. And we need to roll up and look at the variations, at all different levels in the project, all the way down to the person level. And then you need to use that data to make your estimates better. Again, if you end up with things that are outside that bounding box, which is, the average plus and minus 2 standard deviations, you need to look and see why those things were flying and what to do about them. And then lastly, these things shouldn't be a secret. The way to build honesty, transparency, and integrity into your projects is visibility to everyone. Like, don't do stuff except the things that HR makes you do in private. Don't be mean about it. Don't be happy about it. It's just, here are the numbers. Do we need to do anything? If so, what do we need to do? So how do flyers get made? Flyers get made when progress is blocked, there's a failure of quality, or we fail to align to the business need. And for each of those, there are 3 kind of key scenarios and what to do about them. And I invite you to think about these. It may be that some of these are deserving of a longer video. If you think so, please put it in the comments and I'll see what I can do. But, when you look at a user story that ran, say, 50% or 100% or 200% over budget, so to speak, and typically it's over, not under. Under is super rare. Under is the accidental discovery that we've partially done this thing already, or there was a handy library we could have reused that greatly reduced the effort. Yay, that's good. That's absolutely good synchronicity. Yay. But really, the ones that cause us to not have sleep at night are the ones that are over. These 3 categories of things with the 3 use cases are, once you have gotten to the bottom, the root cause analysis of a flyer, one or more of these things is going to be true, and the actions you need to take are pretty clear. It's figuring out how we got it. And then you actually have to do some. Reports are swell, except nobody reads them. But change is change. Boy, I am sick of fighting this fight. Convincing otherwise perfectly sensible human beings, particularly in management, that a single estimate on a single user story, or even just a couple of user stories, is not a commitment, because estimations are approximations. And the only way to get a trustworthy commitment of saying, we have a budget of, 30 story points, these are the things that are going to be in them, is because of that over-under, hopefully all averaging out to 0 with maturity. So you can really only make commitments on aggregates. So when you get called into a meeting and they want to know why user story 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 went from a 2 user point story to a 3 user point story, you have to go and educate them, because otherwise you go down this rat hole and then you rapidly lose confidence in the program, and the developers and other technical staff lose confidence in the management's sanity, and you smart size your project. You got to collect the data, but you got to do stuff with it, right? You have to do things. And the best model for that in pretty much any cyclical process you desire is the all-important OODA loop, which you've seen me use in a bunch of other things or a bunch of other use cases, but it works just as well for this, right? So we orient, we write a story, it has, we say, yes, that is a estimatable thing. And then we decide, we do the estimation, and then we do the work, and then we figure out how much, over under we were. And we look at trends, and we look at variations. So that kind of tracking by person, by role, by project, by train, by whatever. And then, we say, what do we need to change? And if so, what specifically do we need to change? And then, based on those observations, we need to start the orientation again and try to do better next sprint or next whatever. So again, a little reminder on what the score is, right? If you're in charge of delivering some subsystem, this is the one metric that, rules them all. There's an estimation of value delivered minus the bugs and technical debt. And if you're late, what the penalty for lateness is, a bonus for early delivery. And if it turns out that you're delivering value above and beyond the original value that was forecast, then you should get credit for that. Now, the formula here is dead simple. Calculating it requires somebody from finance or an actuary or one of those folks, because there's some math in here. And there's also ways that some of these formulas can go horribly wrong. And so I'm saying someone who knows how to properly compute these things should be the one doing it. And there's software that does this. It looks at your tracking system, your enterprise project management system, and it extracts things and it does this sort of thing for you. And in some cases, it's absolutely worth the money. And lastly, as an individual human being, I will say, and I've said this, I had one of my first bosses said this. He said, the best way to be above average is to be reliable and consistent. Thank you for your kind attention. And if you like this content and want to see more, please like and subscribe. And as always, your comments are more than welcome. Please give me some feedback.